very warm welcome. You're watching World 360. I'm Akanksha Swaroop. Now, the week gone by saw the making of two confrontational blocs challenging the US-led world order, while India has lashed out at the UK for violence at the Indian embassy in London. We'll get into the why and how of the leading global developments this week. But first up are the headlines. China risks credibility as peacemaker in the Ukraine war. President Xi fails to ensure Russian troop withdrawal during his momentous meet with Russian President Putin, a summit that was sharply countered by Japanese Prime Minister Kishida's visit to Ukraine. With special focus on respective presidencies of the G7 and G20, Japan's Prime Minister Kishida visits India to discuss bilateral cooperation, a new plan for the Indo-Pacific, and strengthen a rules-based international order. Issue of vandalism at London's Indian High Commission raised in UK Parliament. India's External Affairs Minister Dr. S. Jaishankar criticises the UK government, says it's the duty of the host country to protect the diplomats. And Israel passes a new law shielding Netanyahu amid mass protests. The Israeli Prime Minister vows to continue with legal reforms. And so the highlight of this week was the tale of two diplomatic visits. The leaders of China and Japan made diplomatic visits to their respective allies and rival capitals. Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida made a surprise trip to Kiev to meet Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky just a day after Chinese leader Xi Jinping arrived in Moscow to meet his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin. The dual visits by Kishida and Xi Jinping underscore deep divisions in Northeast Asia towards the war in Ukraine, with Japan pledging substantial aid towards Kiev, while China remains a lone voice supporting an increasingly isolated Vladimir Putin, now a global pariah and suspected war criminal. Xi's visit has been framed by Beijing as a peacemaking project despite deep skepticism in Kiev and the West. For the United States and much of Europe, the Chinese leader's presence in Moscow has been seen as a ringing endorsement of Vladimir Putin. That too, at a time when his military is running out of supplies and the Russian economy is weighed down by Western sanctions. On the other hand, Kishida's trip is the first time a Japanese prime minister has visited a country or region with ongoing fighting since World War II, and also the first visit to Ukraine by an Asian member of the G7 grouping and the first by a US ally in the region. And just ahead of visiting Kiev, the Japanese Prime Minister was on a two-day visit to India to strengthen bilateral cooperation and security concerns in the Indo-Pacific. Fumio Kishida invited his Indian counterpart Narendra Modi for the Group of Seven summit that happens in May this year. He further announced action plans for a new Indo-Pacific initiative aimed at countering China's influence in the region. It's a Tokyo-led initiative for greater security and economic cooperation that is geared towards curbing Beijing's growing assertiveness, especially in the Indo-Pacific. It includes Japan's assistance to emerging economies, support for maritime security, a provision of Coast Guard patrol boats, and even equipment and other infrastructure cooperation. Modi and Kishida met in 2022, including at Shinzo Abe's funeral. And in 2023, the leaders will meet at least 3 more times on the sidelines of the G20, the G7 and Quad summits. What do these global developments this week mean for the world and for India especially? Let me try and get in a quick perspective, and for that let me introduce my guest. I'm joined in by Ben Aris, who's the editor-in-chief of BNE. Thank you so much, Ben, for joining me live from Berlin. While Xi was backing Putin in Moscow, Japan's Prime Minister paid a surprise visit to Kiev as a show of strength for Zelensky. How do you weigh in on the formation of two confrontational blocs that we saw in symbolic meets on Tuesday?
I think the Japanese visit was timed specifically to counter the Xi visit to Moscow, to say, look, Asia is also divided, and that the Asians, the Japanese, have come out very strongly. They've chosen the Western camp. But that's another thing that's going on. People are increasingly being forced to choose a side. and that you can't sit in the middle anymore. That's, you're getting pulled in into one camp or another.
True.
And China was trying to play the card whereby it was saying that we're neutral, we're going to be a mediator in the Ukraine conflict, we have this peace plan. But in effect, they came out in support of Russia to fight the states. And so there's this polarization going on. And I think this is one of the big dangers of this whole conflict as it goes on, because the fighting itself is contained entirely in Ukrainian soil. But slowly it's spreading out to immerse the whole world into this conflict. And the Americans are traveling around, throwing their power around, threatening other countries, trading with China and Russia. And there's going to be consequences for them. And so everybody is trying to keep out of it, but it's impossible. You're getting pulled in. So I don't know. We'll see what happens. The G20 summit in India this year, where basically, the global South comes to meet with the developed West.
Right. Ben, Russia's ambassador to India has criticized analysts warning India about the Xi-Putin meet, saying that India need not worry. Should India be concerned?
That's a difficult one because the whole relationship between the three countries, Russia, India, China, is very complicated. But like China, they're going to have this problem to not get too embroiled. They don't want to clash directly with the states. They don't want to bring down sanctions. China's playing that game too. To what extent you can do that? At the moment, you can. How much leverage does the state have over China, over India? Not very much. And so how long can you keep that up? I mean, if the escalation continues, then it's going to get more difficult. But then again, at the end of the day, I don't think the West, America, can take on the whole world. And to take on Russia, China, India, and Brazil combined is going to be next to impossible. That's just too big, too powerful. So there's going to be some sort of détente, tension between them. So yeah, it means, look, it's not dangerous per se, but it does mean there's very difficult diplomacy to be done here. Your foreign experts need to be really good at what they're doing in order not to make a mistake.
And that is what the diplomatic tightrope walking is all about. Many thanks to you, Ben. Thoroughly appreciate your inputs. And with that, let's now shift focus over to the UK, continuing to spotlight the removal of the national flag from the Indian High Commission in the UK. The External Affairs Minister of India, Dr. S. Jaishankar, has criticised the UK government. India's Foreign Minister has accused the British government of failing to meet security obligations and slammed its differential standards. Speaking at an event in the Indian city of Bengaluru, Dr. S. Jaishankar reiterated India's demands for an action and not mere assurances. Last week, separatist groups across US, UK and Canada launched a barrage of attacks on Indian embassies and desecrated the Indian flags. And in London, a group of separatist protesters took down the Indian flag, which triggered a furious response in New Delhi as well. After the UK Deputy High Commissioner was summoned, the security barriers outside the UK High Commission and the envoy's residence in the national capital were removed. The London Metropolitan Police arrested one man on suspicion of violent disorder as well. And after the first attack, London police deployed heavy security outside the embassy and announced that it took safety very seriously. Back in Delhi, the Ministry of External Affairs said that words were insufficient. And just ahead of the second planned protests, a large number of Indians gathered in front of the embassy with Indian flags as a support march in solidarity with India. The protests soon turned out to be a celebration of sorts, with the UK police even joining in to shake a leg.
Whenever any country sends an embassy anywhere abroad, it is the obligation of the receiving country to provide the security for a diplomat to do their work. It is the obligation of the receiving country to ensure that the embassy or the High Commission or the consulate, their premises are respected. Okay? These obligations were not met. That day when those, I would say vandals appeared before the High Commission, what was our expectation was not there in terms of security for the High Commission. So we've had conversations with the British government after that. I think the next time it happened, you saw things were a little bit different. But it is our expectation.
And with that, I shift attention over to the United States. The extraordinary legal peril surrounding Donald Trump is reaching a fever pitch. At the same time, the former president is forging ahead in a 2024 Republican primary. The country gets closer every day to a political and judicial precipice that could see a former president indicted for the first time ever. As per the latest media reports, any indictment of Donald Trump might come on Thursday this week at the earliest, and there's no public information as to when or whether an indictment could be filed, leaving the former president and the public in suspense. A New York grand jury investigating Donald Trump over allegations that hush money was given to an adult film star before the 2016 U.S. presidential election. The charges state that Donald Trump's former lawyer, Michael Cohen, gave over $130,000 to Stormy Daniels to prevent her from speaking out about an alleged affair she had with Donald Trump. Previously, Trump had called Daniels horseface and has denied such an encounter ever took place. He further accused the Justice Department of conducting a witch hunt against him. Now, groups of protesters have been gathering outside Manhattan courthouse calling for Trump's indictment. The banners are followed by slogans and chants, jail and indict. While at the same time, supporters of Trump have been rallying near his Mar-a-Lago resort in Florida. Trump supporters waved flags and said prayers on a causeway leading to the Palm Beach resort. And so let's try and weigh in on the latest developments as far as Donald Trump's possible indictment is concerned. For that, let me introduce my guests today. I'm joined in by Crystal Knight, who's a Democrat strategist, Orlando Sanchez, who's a Republican strategist. Crystal, if I may begin with you, while the possible indictment of Trump in the hush money payment case is not connected with his other cases, but many are wondering if an indictment does happen, would this have a domino effect on other cases of Donald Trump?
Well, I think, if the case in New York actually happens, I do think that it will be bad, for the former president moving forward. There's a strong case in Georgia that's being brought up, about him around the election or attempt to defraud the 2020 elections, or the attempt to, overturn them, rather, not defraud, but overturn the election. So I anticipate that the former president will be indicted in the Georgia case. If the case in New York actually happens where he's indicted and charged, it'll just be a domino effect, in my opinion. I think, that's the first chip to fall, and then others will likely fall thereafter. But, again, all of this rests on credible evidence and information that Donald Trump did act improperly and used his office to persuade either members of his cabinet or people that work for him to do things that were illegal, or he took knowingly illegal action.
All right. Orlando, if I could bring you in, on Trump's own social media platform, Truth Social, he has indicated, and I quote, potential death and destruction will happen if he's charged in the probe into the hush money payments. Why aren't Republicans openly disavowing Donald Trump's calls for protests?
Well, first of all, I think it's very irresponsible for a person in a position of authority and former president of the United States to make that statement. But as we all know, Mr. Trump has a history of making incendiary comments. And so it may be that people are just used to it and they just go, that's just former President Trump. But I agree that it is irresponsible and that some people may act on it.
I'm glad that you called a spade a spade. Crystal, Donald Trump is milking his legal jeopardy to boost campaign coffers, capitalizing on an anticipated arrest. Will you call that being smart or just plain shady?
Donald Trump is a grifter. I think he is grifting his supporters. I think even his call that, his supporters rallied this past Tuesday, that was a way for him to raise money. If I were speaking with a Donald Trump supporter right now, I would tell them to wake up, snap out of it. Donald Trump is no longer the elected official of the sovereign land, and they are being bamboozled into believing that he is innocent of anything. There are many things that Donald Trump is guilty of, and justice is slow, but once it actually happens, it can be swift. So I would say to any of his supporters out there, please wake up, look at the facts of each case that is being brought against him, and ask yourself, if this man was truly innocent, why are there cases outstanding that are against him?
Right. Orlando, if I could end with your thoughts, how do you assess the former U.S. president's attempts to capitalize on anticipated charges over this probe by the Manhattan District Attorney?
Well, let me make two comments. Number one, the media in the United States is making the same, they're repeating the same game that they played out, let's say, the first time Mr. Trump ran. They gave him so much attention, so much press coverage, that Mr. Trump didn't have to spend any money because he was on the news every day. And since he has left office, the Democrats have ensured that the national media focuses on Mr. Trump every day. And of course, he's going to milk that. If they wanted to ignore Mr. Trump, he may have had less limelight, but he is in the news every day.
All right. Many thanks to you, Orlando and Crystal, for sharing your precious inputs. And with that, let's shift focus over to Israel. Israel's parliament has passed the first of several laws that make up its contentious judicial overhaul, shielding its Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu as protesters opposing the change continue with their demonstrations aimed at raising an alarm over what they see as the country's descent towards autocracy. Thousands of people protested throughout the country, blocking traffic on main highways and scuffling with police in unrest that shows no sign of abating, especially as the overhaul moves ahead. By a 61 to 47 final vote, the Knesset approved the bill that states that only the Prime Minister himself or the cabinet with a two-thirds majority can declare the leader unfit. The cabinet vote would then need to be ratified by a supermajority in the parliament. Now, TikTok CEO was grilled for over 5 hours on China, drugs and teen mental health by US lawmakers. We'll tell you why it matters. But after a quick break, stay tuned to World 360.
Speaker decides what to do with the disqualification.